Greetings and welcome to episode 107, where Jesus is at the table with the disciples for the Passover meal, Holy Communion as it's come to be made known to us today. Matthew chapter 26, verses 20 through 30. Jesus had ended his public ministry with the coming into Jerusalem, and then he tells the story, the picture, the parable of the end of time that we talked about in a prior episode. Now Jesus is at table with his disciples, celebrating his disciples, all of them, including Judas, celebrating the Holy Supper or the Last Supper or the Passover is what they were celebrating, because being good Jewish guys, they were celebrating the Passover meal. We'll get to that in just a moment. On that day, instead of just having a regular Passover meal, Jesus took the bread and he broke it and he said, "You guys, this is my body given for you. This is the cup, the blood of my suffering shed, given and shed for you." In the church, we call it Maundy Thursday. Maundy is from the Latin word mandatum, commandment. This I command you to love one another. By giving of himself, his body and his blood, Jesus commands us to carry on his love to others, and by that, everyone will know that they're disciples. But let's talk about the 12 disciples, or in the Gospel of Luke, they're called apostles. That's an interesting thing that we'll see when we get to the Gospel of Luke. In Luke, the 12 are called the apostles. The 100, 200, 500 people who followed him are called disciples. In Matthew, Mark, and John, the 12 are just called interchangeably the 12 or the disciples. In Luke, it's a much wider picture. But think of those 12 apostles, those 12 disciples who had been with Jesus. They had seen Jesus wash their feet. They had left everything and followed him. They were the ones who spent 3 years of the most amazing years of their lives with the most amazing person in all of history. And they were the ones who fled Jerusalem once Jesus was crucified. So let's think about those 12 disciples, including Judas, sitting at table with Jesus. Because oftentimes I tend to think of them as untouchable saints, as halos over their heads, as their hands always folded and their eyes focused toward heaven, untouchable, almost sinless, or at least much better than you and I who are normal followers of Jesus. So in reality, these 12 disciples, 12 apostles as Luke calls them, are really kind of a motley bunch. Some would say a ragtag bunch, these 12 disciples. Some were unschooled fishermen. One was a contemptible tax collector. One was a political zealot or patriot. One had a Greek name from an obscure village in Cana of Galilee. Several were known to be quick-tempered. One of them, Judas, was educated and trusted enough to be the treasurer of the 12 disciples, and yet he was the one who became the traitor. Even Peter, the prized disciple and the rock, became the one who denied Jesus not just once, not twice, but 3 times. And for all we think of the disciples, most of us could probably only name 4 or 5 of them, but the rest of them, we don't even remember their names. They're kind of a ragtag bunch of disciples following Jesus. But what's awesome about that in many ways is that they're just like you and me. A ragtag bunch of people doing the best we can to follow Jesus. And on that Maundy Thursday, the Passover meal that Jesus celebrated with them as the hours raced toward Jesus' death, the next day, these men gathered with Jesus for the Passover meal on a night that they would never forget, or that we continue to remember. Early in the evening, while the meal was being prepared, Jesus did something extraordinary. He took a towel, poured water in a basin, and began to wash his disciples' feet. It was not out of the ordinary to get your feet washed upon entering a home, and walking in sandals on dusty paths, one's feet would need a good cleansing. But the person who did that cleaning was always an ordinary household slave. In this case, Jesus, the master, not to mention the Messiah, the Son of God, did the washing. Jesus did the work of a slave and a servant for his disciples. So what must have been going through their minds, do you think? They had followed Jesus not because they felt they deserved such favors from him, but because he asked them to believe, and they believed with sometimes wavering faith. They believed that he was the Messiah from God, and now he stooped to wash their feet. Peter spoke what the others must have been thinking. He said, "No, Lord, you'll never wash me." But Jesus said it must be so, because he was showing them how much he loved them, what kind of love that led him to the cross for them and for the entire world. And he was preparing them for what he wanted to see from them too, and for us, for all of his followers. "I have set an example," Jesus says, "that you should do as I have done for you." They too should wash the feet of others. That's a way of saying that they were to serve others, and no task is too menial. Those unlikely disciples, minus Judas, the betrayer, who left shortly after he had been given the bread and wine, were to become the leaders of Christ's church on earth, but they were to be servant leaders. They were to be foot washers, and Jesus asked no less of us today. Washing feet is an example. I've given Margaret a foot massage, but never washed anybody's feet. But serving others in a task that no task is too menial is what we're to do for one another. And sometimes you wonder, did the disciples ever get the lesson? Did they get it? Well, they did, but not right then. We learn later that in the evening they argued about which one of them was the greatest. Jesus had told them that he would die, and he washed their feet. And then they started to argue about who was the greatest disciple. Well, goodness sakes. What about the other disciples? What about the 11 that were left? Did they ever catch on? Well, remember that we still don't readily remember their names, but they did go out and make a name for themselves and a name for Jesus. They proclaimed to the world the name that was given, which is above every name by which we must be saved. Those first disciples carried the gospel message to the far reaches of their world, and they took huge risks in serving. All but one of these men, we have reason to believe, gave their lives for the gospel of Jesus. Those 11 disciples who went out are sometimes counted among the martyrs of the Christian faith. Only the Apostle John was not executed, but he was exiled to the island of Patmos. And God used John to write the gospel, to write some of the letters of John, and to write the Revelation at the end of the Bible. The other disciples went to faraway places like Great Britain and India and Iran and Greece, even to Russia and North Africa, because Jesus sent them, as he sends us, out to change the world, and they did. He sent them out in faith and obedience, and they went out and they told and they proclaimed and they obeyed. And as the disciples went in their going, Jesus started to change their world and our world. Do you know where the disciples went and what became of them? Well, Simon Peter is viewed by Roman Catholics as the first pope, was eventually martyred in Rome during the reign of Emperor Nero. As the story goes, Peter asked to be crucified upside down so that his death would not be equal to Jesus, and the Romans supposedly obliged. Andrew, the brother of Peter, went to western Greece in 69 AD, where the Roman governor debated religion with him. He tried to convince Roman governor tried to convince Andrew to forsake Christianity so that he wouldn't have to torture him and execute him. But when that didn't work, Andrew was whipped and then tied rather than nailed to a cross so that he would suffer a longer time before dying. Andrew, the story goes, lived for 2 days, during which he preached to those who passed by, hanging on a cross, tied. Hey, can I tell you about Jesus? James, the son of Zebedee, James the Less, he's sometimes called, was killed by a sword by the newly appointed governor of Judea, who was trying to impress the Romans with the death of James. John was the only original disciples to die, not to die a violent death. Instead, he passed away peacefully at Patmos at his ripe old age, somewhere around 95 to 100 AD, and is thought to have written the book of Revelation and the 3 letters of John from a cave in Patmos. Philip was the first of Jesus' disciples to become a missionary in Asia. Eventually, he traveled to the Egyptian city of Hierapolis, where he was scourged, thrown into prison, and crucified in 54 AD. Bartholomew preached in several countries, including India, where he translated the Gospel of Matthew for believers. There are 2 accounts of his death. One, he was crucified or was skinned alive and then beheaded. Yikes. Thomas, doubting Thomas, remember him, went and preached the gospel in Greece and India, where he angered local religious authorities who martyred him by running him through with a spear. Oof da, as they say. Matthew, according to legend, the former tax collector turned missionary, was martyred in Ethiopia, where he was supposedly stabbed in the back by a swordsman sent by the king when he criticized the king's morality. James, who was elected by his fellow believers to head the church in Jerusalem, was one of the longest living apostles, perhaps exceeded only by John. James wrote the first letter of the New Testament in about 49 AD to fellow Christians who dispersed around the Mediterranean world after the persecution in Jerusalem, and he encouraged them to be faithful to what they taught. At the age of 94, he was beaten and stoned by persecutors who then killed him by hitting him on the head with a club. Okay. Thaddeus was crucified in Turkey around 72 AD, and Simon the Zealot died at the hands of an angry mob after preaching on the west coast of Africa. Then he went to England, where he was killed in 74 AD. Both Thaddeus and Simon the Zealot had an intense nationalistic fervor for a free Israel, which drew them naturally to Jesus because they sensed in Jesus the perfect leader for the rebellion that they wanted to start. But Jesus came and touched hearts and minds, and they did carry the word of Jesus to pagan and hostile lands. They were all changed, and a newfound hope in sharing the faith of the gospel with their words brought them danger and eventually the end of their lives. Now, it's safe to say that these men became the leaders that Jesus intended them to be. They didn't get it right away. It took time, which it sometimes does. It took time, but he taught them, he served them, and they grew into faithful followers of Jesus that changed the world forever. So, you think of that. Now Jesus turns to you and he gives you that body and blood, the bread and wine of communion, and asks you, can I change and direct your life? Can I change your head, heart, hands, destiny, and make a life for you by sharing with the world or your world who Jesus is? God changes people from the inside out. Starts, I think, with the head, transforming your mind so that you might know what the will of God is, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So hang in there. Take good steps of faith. Even small steps are good steps if they're steps in the right direction. You take good care. You take good care. Keep grateful. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Until then, bye-bye.